US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He's in Ukraine and in the early hours of this morning announced new aid totaling more than $1 billion US. He made an unexpected visit to Kyiv where he said the US would give further help to Ukraine, including new military and civilian security assistance. Secretary Blinken, standing alongside Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, has said the US would continue to stand by Ukraine's side. Let's just hear a little bit of that now.
The United States is committed to empowering Ukraine to write its own future. In the crucible of President Putin's brutal and ongoing war, the United States and Ukraine have forged a partnership that is stronger than ever and growing every day. We will continue to stand by Ukraine's side, and today we're announcing new assistance totaling more than $1 billion in this common effort.
Secretary Blinken there. Worth noting, the visit to Kyiv comes as there's been another missile strike, one of Russia's deadliest in months. In fact, 17 people are killed and at least 32 wounded. A child amongst the people who have died, we're hearing now as well. But many Americans, just in the background of all of this, they seem to be losing support for the war effort. And by that I mean the billions of dollars are funneled to Ukraine from the US. And we wanted to take a closer look at that now, that public sentiment from abroad. Jessica Trisko Darden is an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University and says many people are focused on cost of living pressures back at home rather than the war in Ukraine. We spoke this morning.
Well, I think we look around and we see the highest seasonal gas prices in a decade. We see children going back to school this week without adequate school bus staff to get them to school, without air conditioners in the midst of a massive heat wave. And I think many Americans ask to themselves where the government's priorities are and why it is the case that we have an additional $1 billion to provide to Ukraine when we can't even get our children into functioning schools this week. And I think that's where a lot of this sentiment is coming from. I also think it's related to fatigue about this constant doling out of funds to Ukraine. At this point, as of June, we had provided $46.6 billion in military assistance alone. So in a sense, another billion sounds like a drop in the bucket, but another billion also sounds like an unjustified amount given the needs that we have here at home.
Yeah, so how do you see this playing out? Because this conflict shows no signs of coming to an end. I don't think that's controversial to say. As you say, the cost of living crisis continues back home. Do you think that public sentiment about support for Ukraine is going to continue to wane?
I think what's really clear is that the extent of foreign assistance, both military and economic, that we've provided to Ukraine up to this point has not proven decisive in this conflict, right? It has not led to an outright Ukrainian victory, and it looks unlikely to do so. Public support for the war is also waning in Ukraine. We see men who are refusing to show up for their conscription orders. We see continued illegal outmigration from the country in defiance of the martial law that President Zelensky imposed. And so my concern is where support for this ongoing conflict is coming from, both in the United States and in Ukraine. And what I see is that the arms industry has been booming as a result of this conflict. I see reports that there's extensive graft in Ukraine and that President Zelensky has had to, empty out his own people to deal with graft issues. And yet the Senate Democrats have voted against an amendment that would establish oversight through an inspector general for Ukraine. So both Ukraine and the United States are not providing effective oversight for this assistance either. So it's very hard to make the argument that pouring more money into Ukraine is going to solve the country's military or economic problems.
I guess flipping that around, though, isn't the argument that without that support, Ukraine would face a tough time on its own as it continues to fight against Russia? I mean, it needs that military support.
It needs that military support if it is going to continue fighting the type of war that it's been fighting. But certainly that there are other sources of support, other NATO member countries, other European countries, other allies who could do much more to step up their own support of Ukraine, who are closer to the conflict, who have a lot more directly invested in its outcome. And I think this links to broader debates about burden sharing in terms of global security and the NATO alliance. It also points to kind of really real constraints that the U.S. military is now facing in terms of its own needs, in terms of arms, in terms of tactical equipment, and whether these continual drawdowns that Secretary Blinken mentioned are actually impeding the United States' ability to fight the types of wars that it foresees fighting.
Yeah, and look, important and interesting observations, particularly when we are hearing the Secretary of State and Joe Biden saying, they're going to continue to stand by Ukraine. Do you find that support for the war has drawn along political allegiances as well? And by that I mean, do you think Republicans are more opposed to aid than Democrats, for example?
No, I think both parties are divided within themselves over this. So, for instance, Secretary Blinken also mentioned in that clip that they were providing additional funding for mine clearing. Well, the United States is sending cluster munitions to Ukraine, and we are still clearing cluster munitions and unexploded ordnances from countries like Laos from the Vietnam War. So if we think that sending cluster munitions is not going to contribute to an existing problem in Ukraine, we're not being real. And I think folks on the left will point to things like this as the hypocrisy in the U.S. position on Ukraine. Well, folks on the right will point to the fact that all of this defense spending is actually weakening the U.S.'s military position overall. Folks in the middle will say, well, this aid is important, but are we giving the right types of aid? Are we giving it at the right timing? What are the oversight functions that are being held? So I think there's a variety of opinions that don't cut clearly across partisan divides, but we will certainly see Republican presidential contenders use this conflict for their own talking points and whatever agenda they're trying to promote.
Yes, certainly topical considering, that report yesterday from the Cluster Munitions Coalition. The vast majority of people who died in those munitions strikes in the last year were civilians. Just on that point of political allegiances, though, the US presidential election, as you just flagged, a little over a year away, Donald Trump the favourite for the Republican nomination. I mean, if he does get back into office, what do you think that could mean for the Ukrainian war effort?
I think that the Ukrainian war effort has really been focused not so much on convincing the public, and as you pointed out in this latest poll, the public is not convinced, but on convincing important political elites in Washington that they need to fight this as some kind of Cold War redux, anti-Russia war, or they need to support it for democracy promotion purposes. I think there are lots of different arguments that have been bandied about. I think what we know about former President Trump is that he doesn't really buy any of those arguments. So to the degree that Ukraine would continue to seek kind of strong presidential backing for the war, that they would need to come up with a more plausible, convincing argument for him as an individual. However, at the end of the day, Congress controls the purse strings, and Congress continues to choose to pile money into this conflict and can continue to do so well into the future.
Jessica Trisko Darden, their Associate Professor of Political Science at Virginia Commonwealth University, joining us a little bit earlier this morning from Ashland, Virginia.